Hi everyone, today we're going to learn how to use these small bead looms. The first thing you need to decide is whether you want, if you're going to try to make a bracelet, you need to decide whether you want to use these little clasps, these slider clasps on the end of your bracelet, or if you'd prefer to use leather ends and little ties. Nice thing about this kind of end is you can have these long straps, so even if you only get a little teeny bit done, you can extend your bracelet by having these long straps underneath so that you can tie them. What is important to note is if you are going to try for this style with these sliders, you will have to use small beads for these to slide on to the end. These size 8 beads will not fit these. So these size beads will not fit these. What I did to get this to work, I'll be showing you later. Let's get started with our graph paper. So the first thing you can do is get a piece of graph paper and kind of design how you might like to make your beads. If you have some colored markers, you can mark in the colors directly onto the graph. If you don't have colored markers, then what you can do is just write the first letter of the color you're going to do. So you might go R, 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 R for red, and then R for red, B for black, and you can just put the first letter of every color in your chart to design what you're going to do. This particular one was only going to be using 3 colors, and I think I'm actually going to end up using these 3 colors, and these ones are again going to be size 8 because then it'll be quicker for me to make one and also easier for you guys to see on the camera. And so threading your loom is actually very easy. I was pleasantly surprised about that. So in your box or your kit, you should have this wire frame and then these 2 pieces here and some thread. And if on the box anyways, it puts this at one end and then at the opposite end, and I don't know if that matters, but that's just what I'm going to do. So you take this, fit it on here, like that. You can just leave it loose for now because you might be, well, not too loose, but just a little bit loose because you might be adjusting it later. And then the one on the other side, since I've got that one going that way, I'll put this one on this side. I don't know if it matters, but I'm just doing what they did on the box. Okay, so you got your little wood ends on. Now you're going to take your thread and you're going to tie a knot on this little peg here. I'm actually going to use black because the edging of my bracelet is going to be black beads, so then this thread will blend in better. I'm going to tie this probably a few times. Okay, now all you do is you take this piece of thread, go straight down the center, straight down to the other side, and wrap it around the peg. Then you come up this side exactly beside the string you just did, and then down to this other side, and then wrap it around the peg. Now you're on the other side, so you put the string right beside where you put the other one, right beside that one, and wrap it around the peg. You don't actually tie it or anything, you just do one wrap. Then you go into the next slot, into the next slot, around the peg, then you go to the next side, and again around the peg. Now you do this until you get the number of strings that you need. Back. Okay, and then you can just wrap it a few times around here. Now, how I know what I want, on my graph that I made, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 colors of beads. So you always need one more string than beads. So this will be 8 strings because I'm only using 7 beads. Okay, so next you want to try and make this a little bit more of a tension, and that's what this little wheel is for. So you can turn your wheel to make this tighter and then do up the little knob tighter, and then you can do the same thing on the other side. It already is pretty tight, but I'm just going to tighten this part so it doesn't move on me. Okay, so that's actually pretty good, except this last string has come out because I haven't tied it yet. So I'm going to have to cut it off, wrap it around here again, and then maybe I'll tie it to this leg here. I want to try a trick at the end of this. Something to keep in mind is that when we're making this, we will be putting ends on our bracelet, and it will be covering up 1 or 2 rows depending on what method we do. So you might want to just do a couple rows of whatever color to begin with. So 1 or 2 rows of the beads are going to get inside this piece of leather, so they won't even show up. Please note that the thread that comes with this, I noticed it tangles quite easily, so I also recommend waxing your thread. So you're just going to tie a knot onto the very outer string. Leave yourself a tail though, because you will want to weave this tail back in through your work later, and you want to have enough room to put a needle back on here so that you can do that without it being too short. So you string your beads on, and what you do is you bring your needle underneath the row of strings to bring it to the other side. Okay, if you want, you can turn this so that it's easier for you. Then what you're going to do is from your hand underneath and push all the beads up. In between each string there should be 1 bead. Then you're going to take your needle, and right now this string here is underneath these strings under here. So now we're going to take our needle and bring it through these beads, but just make sure that you're bringing it through on top of these strings. And there you have it. All right, get your next set of beads. Bring them down. Again, you're going to go under with the needle to the other side. And you're going to do the same thing. Push every bead up in between the lines, the strings, and then thread your needle through. Thread your needle through the top. And that's all there is to it. You're going to repeat this. Keep repeating this. Get your next row of beads, go under, and then back through the top. And you just keep doing that for however long you want. Okay, so if you ever run out of thread, you can start, you could start tying another piece at where you left off and then just continue. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly show you that if you'd like to use these clasps on the end, but you really do enjoy the bigger sized 8 beads here, what I'm doing on this one is I actually did my first 2 rows in the smaller beads, and then I'm going to do the rest of my pattern in 8, and when I get to the very end I'll do 2 rows of the small ones again. The only thing I will say is I had a little bit of difficulty starting this first 8 row because the strings were closer together now because it thought I was doing a smaller pattern, but I was able to do it. It just takes a little bit extra effort to get the beads in between here when they're closer together. But once you've got that first row done, the rest will be a piece of cake because now they're spaced properly. To finish this off, which is what I'm going to do because I don't have a lot of string left, and I'll just make this into a bracelet with longer ties. So if you want to avoid having to weave all these strings back up into here, all you have to do is go like this and weave your needle back and forth, back and forth, back and forth through here, and we're going to kind of make a bunch of threads at the end. Oh, I gotta figure out that was coming down. Okay, and you just can do this until you get a good amount of stitches at the end. Okay, so just keep going back and forth till you get a big grouping of threads, and then you can just pull them tightly by just kind of going through the group of them together now and making little knots. Just to pull these tight. It doesn't really matter what these look like because we're going to be covering it over with either a metal clamp or leather, depending on what you choose. Okay. And then you'll do that same thing on this same bit of stitching at the other end. And if you didn't leave yourself a long enough tail, then you can just tie another piece of string here and then do the same thing on that end. And then what you want to do is get some glue and just put some glue on the stitches and then let it dry, and then you can cut these strings off. You can cut them off really close after you've done the glue. And then I'll show you how we can finish it off with either some leather or a clamp. If you want even more security, you could take this last tail and go back through a couple rows before you cut it off. My string is pretty short, so I can't really go too much farther, but now I can snip this off here. Alright, so we can let this glue dry now, and I'm going to work on the other end. I'm actually going to show you another way to finish the end that might be better if you're doing this in a workshop type situation where you don't have time to let the glue dry. Okay, you're just going to cut your work off the loom. Okay, so you're just going to start tying the outer two, and then the next two, and then the next two. And so if you're going to do a bracelet, I would start a little bit farther down so you have longer strings when you cut them off. But I've tied them all now, and then I'm going to take a group of 2 that have been tied with the next group of 2 that have been tied, and then I will tie those groups of 2 together, like, so you'll kind of be doing 4 strings now. And then you could trim these a little bit shorter so that they can go inside the clamp. So I just wanted to quickly mention that if you're having trouble tying your knots, you can tape down your piece to hold it in place to make it a little bit easier when you're trying to tie these knots. And when you get a few knots tied, you could always tape down a couple of the pieces over here, so then you can finish doing this without having all the ends in your way. Okay, so we have a couple ways we could finish this off, and the first way is using these slider clasps. And I was hoping to show you this, but because I used the size 8 beads, these are actually not big enough. Even though when I bought them it said they were for size 8 beads and size 11 beads. Okay, so now we're going to cut a little square of leather or suede to make a little end like this that will open in the middle, and you will be able to glue, cut your strings shorter here, and then the little string tails and the first couple rows of beads will go in there. I do want to point out that when I first did this one, I made it a little bit wider, and then I tried to trim it after, and it ended up cutting some of my beads because I couldn't see very well like where the beads were inside the piece of leather. So I would trim your size to what you need before you glue it on. So this one's going to be a little bit too big, so I'm going to trim it to be a little bit smaller. And then I will now show you how I made this one. And how we do this is you cut a square, and then you have to make 2 slits. And it took me watching a video several times to actually get this right. So I think it's because they failed to mention that there was actually 2 slits and I had first made 1. So actually you kind of figure out where your center is. If you have a good pair of scissors, you can fold it in half like this, and then you can cut there and there, and you'll end up with your 2 slits. But all I have is this right now, so what I'm going to do is figure out approximately where my center is, right about there, and then I'm going to make a slit on one side of where center is, and then another slit just below that. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, but there is 2 slits in here now. Okay, next you need to get yourself some lace of some sort and get a big enough piece so that when you put it on you'll be able to tie it underneath. So you're going to take about 12 inches maybe, and you're going to fold it in half like this. And if you can, you're going to push this folded through to the other side, or you can do it one at a time actually. So you push this through, or if it's too thick, you can actually thread one through and then thread the other through. Just depends on what works for you. But I'm going to try doing it this way and just taking a pair of pliers and trying to pull it through here. Okay, so far you're like this through the one little cut there. Now you're going to keep going and bring it through the other side if you can fit, or if you might need to make your hole a little bit bigger. That's why it might be better just to bring through one at a time, but this worked for me, so I'm going to do it. Okay, so there. So you end up like this with a loop coming through one side and your two tails coming through the other. So it's like this. Next, you're going to bring the two tails through the hole like that and slowly pull this down until it's tight. And because I'm doing suede with suede right now, it's not super easy to pull. It just depends on what you're using. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, so I'm just going to put a teeny bit of glue on the knots here before I cut them. Before I cut the strings. All right, now I'm going to put some glue inside this. And see how I'm going to be hiding the first few rows of beads. Now I would recommend maybe gluing this at home, not doing it at the workshop, because it does need to stay in position for at least a day to dry. So once you've got the glue on, you can tape it down to something to get it on there very tightly so it can dry like that, and then in a day you can remove it. So I would make your little leather ends before you go today, or cut your pieces and your supplies to make it at home, and then glue this when you get home, and you can leave it somewhere. Okay, so here's one final way you can end your beading is, I'm going to snip off this one that I tied. Okay, you can take off these loops that you've put around here, except for the one that was tied at the very beginning. That one I'll have to snip off. Okay, and then you can do the same thing on the other end. Loosen this and just take these loops off. Okay, these loops at the end. You can get rid of quite a few of these loops. Instead of cutting them, you can pull these loops. Not all of them will pull, so you just kind of have to test. You can pull one loop at a time, and see which ones will pull through. So that string won't. Try the other end now. There we go. This one's going to pull. Okay, you got to kind of hold your beadwork down from getting all bent up, which I see it just did now on the end here, so I got to fix that. Here comes another one. Okay, that must have been the end piece because it's straight. Okay, and you can see it's pulling from the other end. So now they're all coming down to this end. Okay, so once you're done pulling the strings through, they're all going to be on this end. In this end, you may only end up with 1 or 2 strings left, which you can tie together a few times. And it doesn't matter if it's a little bit wonky at this end because you're going to be covering it up anyways, but you may have to do a little bit of stretching to stretch the beads back when you've been pulling the loops through. And then at this end, you can do what we did on the previous demo, where you can cut these loops into single strands and then tie them all together. So you can tie the first 2 together, then strings 3 and 4 together, 5 and 6 together, and 7 to 8 together, and then you can do the groupings, tie them together. And I did also want to show you that not every time have I been successful at pulling all the loops through to the other end. For some reason these 2 would not pull through, so I'm just going to cut these at the end, and then I will tie them down here just like I'm doing on this end. So now I'm going to see if these clips will work. You just have to open this end a little bit more, and then because I did the 2 rows of the really small beads at the end, you see how there's the 2 smaller rows of beads at the end. This should fit now. Now I've tied all the little ends together, so there's some knots at the end here, and I've got my loose side pieces still here, so I'm just going to thread them through the beads a little bit before I cut them off. You can kind of just go through a few and then go through a few in the other row to make it tighter as opposed to going through the whole row. Then maybe you can go through 2. Alright, I'm going to go through 1, and then I'm going to go through the loop to tie it more like a knot. Maybe do that twice. Okay, now I can trim this off. Okay, and now you can just trim these ends off slightly. Well, you need to trim them quite a bit so that they can go in the clasp at the end. Okay, so now I've closed the end. And now all you have to do is put a little jump ring on there and a little lobster claw, and then on this end you actually need another jump ring, I think, and then this, and then you'll be able to attach it together and make yourself a bracelet.